All right, let's get right into it. We are talking about one of the most incredible stories in modern business. It's a story of a corporate giant that didn't just stumble, it completely and spectacularly imploded, only to then rise from its own ashes in a way that honestly almost defies belief. This is the story of Japan Airlines.
And believe me, that is not an exaggeration. Before its big turnaround, JAL became a national symbol of failure. So to really understand how amazing its rebirth was, we first have to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the disaster.
So let's set the scene. Act 1, the collapse. Before it became this incredible case study in success, JAL was basically a textbook example of a company that was completely rotting from the inside out.
I mean, just look at that number. By 2010, this was JAL's debt. That's over 25 billion US dollars. It wasn't just losing money, it was a financial black hole just swallowing up capital with absolutely no end in sight.
But the debt was really just a symptom of a much deeper problem, a sick company culture. The company had become this bureaucratic monster. Imagine this, the pilots, the maintenance crews, the sales department, they weren't one team. Nope. They were like these rival kingdoms, these little fiefdoms, all working in their own bubbles. A manager could fly a totally empty plane across the country and have no idea, and, more importantly, zero responsibility for how much money that flight was losing. This kind of paralysis led directly to the inevitable, bankruptcy in January 2010.
And that just perfectly sets the stage for Act 2. When a company fails that spectacularly, who do you even call to fix it? The answer, in this case, well, it was something nobody saw coming.
Yep, you heard that right. The person they brought in to save a multi-billion-dollar airline was a 77-year-old entrepreneur turned Buddhist priest who knew absolutely nothing about airplanes. It sounds like the start of a joke, right? But it just shows you how desperate the situation really was. Inamori didn't bring industry experience. He brought two radical ideas, what you could call a calculator and a moral code. So this was his calculator, the Amoeba system. The idea was actually beautiful in its simplicity. You take this huge, messy blob of a company and you slice it up into tiny, self-contained units of just 10 or 20 people. Each one of these little amoebas would be responsible for its own profits and losses. So how did this work in the real world? Well, suddenly, a single flight crew wasn't just a crew anymore. They were a tiny business. They knew the exact cost of fuel for their flight and the revenue from their tickets. Departments started selling services to each other, so maintenance would actually charge flight operations for repairs. And this is where the behavioral change was just brilliant. Flight attendants started calculating the extra fuel cost of carrying uneaten meals and cut back. Everyone became an entrepreneur. What this did was introduce this intense, market-driven, you could even call it hyper-capitalist pressure into every single corner of the company. There was nowhere to hide. Every single yen that was spent was now visible and had to be justified. Now, you might be thinking that kind of pressure could create a really toxic, cutthroat culture. And you'd be right. Inamori knew this. That's why he paired his calculator with a moral code, something he called the JAW philosophy. This was the counterbalance, and it was just as important. The whole philosophy was built on the principle of altruism. Inamori declared that the company's #1 goal wasn't shareholder value, but the well-being of its employees. This created this incredibly powerful sense of shared purpose. People weren't just cutting costs to get a bonus. They were doing it out of a debt of gratitude to save the jobs of their colleagues. It was this brilliant fusion of hard numbers and human values. So, did this strange combination of a monk, amoebas, and altruism actually work? Well, the results were absolutely staggering, creating one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in history. Just look at that chart. The change wasn't gradual. The sources describe it as instant and violent. From a 63 billion yen loss before the bankruptcy to a mind-boggling 205 billion yen profit just a couple of years later. It's an absolutely incredible reversal. And this number right here puts it all in a global perspective. At a time when most airlines were just struggling to break even, JAL achieved a 17% operating margin. That made it, for a time, the most profitable major airline on the entire planet. The Phoenix had truly flown. But the story doesn't end there. Of course not, because after solving one existential crisis, JAL now finds itself facing a completely different one, a ghost from Japan's future that its old solutions simply cannot fix. This is the 2030 problem. Japan's population is shrinking, and that's creating a massive labor shortage. Now, JAL's entire growth strategy depends on its low-cost subsidiary, ZIPAIR, which needs tons of staff to expand rapidly. But the people, they simply aren't there. Airports are already turning away flights because they don't have enough ground crew.
So it all boils down to this fundamental clash. JAL has the capital and the strategy to buy a whole fleet of new planes for ZIPAIR, but it doesn't have the pilots, the mechanics, or the baggage handlers to actually operate them.
And this brings us to today, and to a decision that is going to define JAL's future. So I want you to step into the boardroom for a minute. You've seen the history, you understand the culture, and now you are facing an impossible choice. The government wants more flights for tourists. Your investors are demanding the growth you promised. The pressure is immense. You have two clear paths forward, and neither one of them is perfect. Okay, path one is Operation Open Skies. You go all in on growth. You aggressively hire foreign contract workers, and you lower your hiring standards just to get bodies on the tarmac. You'll hit your revenue targets, but you risk diluting the very JAL philosophy that saved the company. Path two is Operation Fortress Jail. You protect the culture at all costs. You cap your growth, you stay a premium brand, and you focus on quality. You preserve what makes JAL so special, but you give up on the future growth market, and you're going to anger your investors.
So, what do? This isn't just a question for Japan Airlines. It's a dilemma every successful company eventually faces. When the strategy that made you great suddenly conflicts with the reality of the future, which do you sacrifice? The engine of growth or the soul of the company? What's the right move?